Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard Gaming. Today I've got another episode of utterly pointless comparisons for you. You might think since it's been a little while since the last entry in this series that I was done with it, but if you think that,
well, you're wrong!
In this video I'll be showing you the arcade and Saturn versions of the motorcycle racing classic Manx TT Superbike. Well, sort of classic. As usual, I'll show you the specs of each hardware platform while I tell you a little bit about the game. Sega released Manx TT Superbike into the arcades in 1995 on their famous Model 2 platform that had powered games like Virtua Fighter 2 and Daytona. It was developed by two of Sega's well-known AM divisions, AM3 and AM4. AM3's last racing title before this one was the fantastic Sega Rally, which I covered a while back. AM3 would later become known as Hitmaker, by the way. AM4 would later be rebranded Amusement Vision and would later create titles like F-Zero GX and Super Monkey Ball. Now if you thought Sega Rally was a bit limited with its 4 tracks, well, grab those pearls and clutch them, my friends, because Manx TT Superbike only has 2 tracks, and it's really more like 1.5 since some of the road is the same on both courses. Now that's okay for an arcade game which you'll only play for a few minutes at a time anyway, at least. Plus, it's based on the real-life Isle of Man race. In the grand scheme of things, Manx TT Superbike is alright. It's not as good as Daytona or Sega Rally, not by a long shot. It's also way harder than either of those games, and the racing just doesn't feel as solid, but it's still pretty good overall. Manx TT Superbike came home to the Saturn in 1997. It was developed by Perfect Entertainment / Tantalus Software in cooperation with Psygnosis. As far as ports from the Model 2 to the Saturn go, it's not too bad. I'd place it between stuff like Daytona Champion Circuit Edition and Sega Rally. It looks and feels just a tinge smoother than Daytona CCE, but it's not as good as Sega Rally on the Saturn. It still only has the 2 courses from the arcade version, but it adds reverse and mirror versions of the tracks to give the game a little more variety. It also adds a Saturn mode with a practice option and the ability to take on any of the quote-unquote new courses. It's still limited and is pretty easy compared to Sega's other, more famous racers on the system. Alright, let's talk recording methodology here. Now I used the Nebula Model 2 emulator to record the footage from the arcade version of the game, and you'll notice there are a few minor issues here and there. First, there are a few very minor visual hiccups, but it still gives you an idea of the fidelity of the arcade version, and it looks very close. And you'll notice that there's a lot of sound effects missing in the arcade version. That's mainly because I forgot you have to go into the settings and enable extra sound channels for this game, so sorry about that. I wasn't going to re-record the footage over it, since the effects don't really play that big a role anyway, and you can still hear all the music and some of the effects. So I know it's not perfect, and we may see some improved Model 2 emulation in MAME soon, but I thought it was long past time to cover this game, so here we are. Okay, let's get on with it. And we're underway. So we've got the arcade on the left, of course, Saturn on the right. I changed the arcade to the Player 2 color, which is blue. Player 1 is red in the arcade. Oh, so that's a change. If we look at the, the track here on the left side on the arcade, you can see there is way more detail in the track side. And all the obstacles and the hills, and the buildings that are on them. It just looks tremendously better than the Saturn version. Saturn version doesn't look terrible. It looks, I would say, worse in a direct comparison with the arcade than if you see it, just by itself. It's an okay-looking racing game for the system. Doesn't look as good as Sega Rally, but as I mentioned before, I think it probably mostly looks a little bit better than Daytona Champion Circuit Edition, as it's just a little bit smoother overall in most places. But yeah, the level of detail on the track has just been greatly reduced, particularly on those hillsides and things like that. Now, as far as the gameplay goes, the two games really feel quite different, I've got to say. So in the arcade, it's all about the handling, and there are versions of it where you sat on a bike and you tilted, in order to control it. The Saturn version supports the Saturn analog pad, the 3D pad that came with Knights. That's how I mainly played it back in the day when it was new. I did get this game when it was brand new. And I liked it for the time it came out. It was pretty impressive. But anyway, the analog controls are pretty good in this one. The digital controls are also pretty good. When you're using a digital controller on this one, you're going to do a lot of tapping. Like you see me constantly tapping and leaning just a little bit over and over again. And that's just the nature of playing this with a D-pad. So one thing I didn't really talk about here yet is the difficulty. The arcade version of Manx TT Superbike is insanely hard. It is incredibly, insanely, crazily hard. I have it reduced to the easiest possible difficulty setting here, and I will barely manage to eke out a win and come in first place in the arcade one. The Saturn version I am playing with completely default settings, and it's just much easier. I mean, even though I haven't played the Saturn version in probably, I don't know, 20 years, when I sat down to play it to record this video, I came in first on the first track on my first try. So that tells you just how much easier the Saturn version is than the arcade one. And how did I change the arcade difficulty? Well, when you're in Nebula, you can go into the test mode, and inside the test mode you can change a whole bunch of options, including the difficulty and basically what version of the game that you're running. And you can do that on a per track basis. So you can have one track be super easy and the other track be really hard. Now the other thing that's a little visually weird here is the colors are just a lot warmer in the arcade version versus the Saturn one. We've got a much cooler tone on the road and everything. And you can see in first place in the arcade one I was standing up and that crowd is clapping behind me and they're animated. In the Saturn version, we get a very still, sad-looking crowd that doesn't move at all. In the arcade one, as we finish the first track, we get credits. You put your quarters in, you finished your race, this is how it ends if you're in first place. Saturn version, you don't see credits unless you finish the harder track. Alright, so after this first track, what exactly do we know about this game and what can we say about it so far? It's running about 30 frames per second on Saturn versus 60 for the arcade. Texture resolution is a lot lower, the screen resolution is lower, and the controls and handling are quite a bit different between the two versions. Now the second track has some things that I would classify as visually a little more complex. We'll see how the second track fares compared to the first. Alright, so here's the second track, the TT track. Oh, and another thing I should mention that you can control in the arcade version is you can set the number of laps, on each track. So not every arcade racing game had that as an option. Now I've got to say, for this second track, while I talked a lot about visual downgrades, in the first track, they're a lot more apparent on this one. You're going to see some long straightaways here, where the Saturn version just looks way worse than the arcade original. There's no other way to say it. And there will be a little bit more pausing here. It was tougher to get the timing. The timing is very different between these two games, so syncing these up was a little bit harder than I expected it was going to be. So sorry for the few pauses I had to insert on this one, but look at the roadsides here. Looks tremendously better in the arcade. The road itself has a lot more detail on it. You see a lot more painted lines, a lot more road symbols. There's just a whole lot more things. Now the one area where the Saturn version is maybe a smidge better is the music. All the music in the Saturn version is Red Book audio, so it sounds a little bit better. Red Book audio, of course, being straight up CD audio that's recorded to the disc and burned as a track, rather than being generated by sound chips within the system, like the Model 2 version of the game. But yeah, visually, again, coming back to it, it looks so much, worse on the Saturn on this one. And again, it's still not bad, right? We've seen racing games on the Saturn that look way worse than this one. But they accomplished enough on this that you'd think they could have made these roadside obstacles, and hillsides and all that stuff look a little bit better. It really just gives you the impression of kind of being unfinished. Like maybe they had planned to go back and add more detail after they got, the rough frame of the game up and running, and they just never got around to it. I don't know if that's what happened. I haven't seen much about the development of this game. And the development of this game was done by, a company called Perfect that later became known as Tantalus. They're an Australian company. They had a deal with and worked with Psygnosis, a lot in those days especially. And this game was made in cooperation with Psygnosis for Sega. So you'll see, all Western names in the credits in the Saturn version after I beat it here. And I will note that on the Saturn version, I did come in first. Like I said, this one is a little bit on the easier side than the arcade one. In the arcade version, I came in 7th, but I'm going to show you the ending that you get when you come in first, even though I didn't reach it here. Because I had played this game multiple times, and I didn't feel like spending any more time on it. I got through the whole track. I made it to the end of the race. That's all I wanted to get, done for the comparison here, so you could see the entire game. So that's what I wanted to accomplish there. Remember, it's not about my gameplay. This isn't me saying, hey, look how great I am. This is me just saying, hey, Here's the entire game on both platforms. And the road, I've got to say also in that last section, so much less detail, less shadowing, less painted lines on the road again. You know, I wish they had squeezed a little bit more of that to give this game a little bit more of the atmosphere of the arcade game. And one thing I'll point out here while we're waiting is that the colors of the road, the tones, seem a lot warmer here on the second track than they did on the first, and much more similar to the arcade, even though they're not identical. It makes me wonder a little why they went with such cooler tones on the first track. My only guess there is they probably wanted to differentiate the two tracks a little bit, you know, and add a little bit more of variety into the look of everything. One other difference I'll point out here also that I should have probably mentioned a lot earlier is that your speed gauge and everything is a lot bigger in the arcade. It's kind of intrusive and in the way in third-person mode, while in the Saturn it's a little bit thinner and pushed more off to the side. Alright, so here's my daring first place finish on the Saturn, and my less than acceptable 7th place finish in the arcade version. Oh well, what are you gonna do? But let's pretend that I came in first in the arcade. Because when you come in first, you will get an ending. You'll get credits, and I will show the credits to you in both versions in just a moment here. They are not the same, the names are a lot different for the reasons I mentioned before, but also the entire, bit of the end credits are different. So we don't see the same angles, or anything as we go through this. So I'm going to give you a full summary as soon as I'm done here. We should never have expected, the Saturn version to match the Model 2 version. It had been long established by then that cutbacks were always going to be necessary in any port from the Model 2 to the Saturn. So for the cuts that are here, they're mostly alright. I just wish they could have squeezed in a little more detail. Also, of course, I just couldn't do this video without showing you any footage of you doing the cheat where you get to ride on a sheep. Enjoy for a few moments. Look at that sheep go. And you gotta love that the song starts with Mary Had a Little Lamb. Nice touch. Ah well, let's wrap this up. Alright, there we go, a complete comparison of the two tracks present in both the arcade and Saturn versions of Manx TT Superbike. Now visually, obviously, the original arcade Model 2 version looks way better than the Saturn version, there's no denying that. And that's to be expected, the Model 2 spec is much higher than the Saturn. The system can push way more polygons per second. Obviously, the frame rate is roughly halved in the Saturn version as well, compared to the Model 2 original. Now, a lot of the visual details are a bit rougher in the Saturn version, and they're rougher than they needed to be. They don't look as good as some of the other racing games that came along before this one. As far as the gameplay goes, the insane difficulty of the arcade version was way toned down for Saturn, as I mentioned, and I would say maybe even too much, as the tracks in the Saturn version are really kind of a breeze, and any experienced racing game fan will find themselves completing both courses in the space of probably 30 to 60 minutes. While it adds some of the extras like the reversed and mirrored tracks I talked about, they really should have added at least a couple of more original tracks to this game. As I said, I got this game brand new back in the day, and it feels like half a game at best. Which one of these two games would I rather play? I'd probably say the Saturn version, even though it's a big visual downgrade. The arcade one is just overly difficult, particularly on the TT track. You can get good at it, but it's just not that much fun, to be honest. The Saturn version is a lot more fun to play, and I'd say it's mainly because the AI racers are a little more varied. It of course also has the same system split screen mode that I mentioned. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Windows port from back around the same time as the Saturn version of the game was released. It is based on the Saturn port, but it looks nicer. It has a much better draw distance and runs at a much smoother frame rate. However, it's missing even more visual details than the Saturn version in places. So there's no true, really definitive way to experience the game. Each of the three versions that were out around the same time have key disadvantages and advantages. The arcade version looks the best, I'd say the Saturn version plays the best, and the Windows version is a happy medium between the two. So what do you all think? Have you played the arcade and Saturn versions of Manx TT before? Or maybe the Windows version? Was this your first time seeing the game on any platform? Tell me all about your Manx TT experience in the comments. And that'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoy the video, please like and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of my videos. If you want to support the work that I do here, you can do that on Patreon, Ko-fi, or right here on YouTube through things like Super Thanks or channel memberships. With that, I'll say thanks Thanks for watching, and see me later.